What is civil disobedience? Civil disobedience is a form of protest against injustice, against oppression. So it involves a particular kind of strategy that not all forms of resistance require. So there are all kinds of forms of passive resistance, resistance that engages in nonviolence, which is a key aspect of civil disobedience, is nonviolent resistance. What makes and that's the civil part of it, what makes it the disobedience part is that there is an active refusal to obey laws that are deemed unjust. What does that mean? Well, it means that if there is a law that is unjust and you are seeking to protest that law through civil disobedience, then you are required to break that law. Otherwise, it's not civil disobedience. It's just passive resistance. So that's the active part of it. That is the disobedient part. Going along with that is then the willingness to accept the punishment that is unjustly given as a result of breaking that law. And then third, finally here, although as already mentioned, there is the refusal to engage in violence as either offense or defense. So that means not only do you not engage in armed struggle, but further, even if acted upon violently, you do not react with violence. And that is perhaps the most difficult part of the formulation here, but it does come in three parts, therefore. Right? It is active engagement, active refusal to obey the law, acceptance of the punishment that is given, and nonviolent reaction to even violent oppression. So the reading that we have for tonight is from Henry David Thoreau. This is he. He is primarily known as a literary figure. He wrote famously the book Walden, which he wrote about spending 2 years living at the Walden Woods. He was an associate of Ralph Waldo Emerson in the Transcendentalist School from New England of literature and philosophy in the 19th century. He wrote Civil Disobedience in 1849 after being arrested for refusal to pay a poll tax. And this is the document that we will look at a little bit later tonight. Walden actually came afterward and made him much more famous than Civil Disobedience did, but Civil Disobedience ultimately, from a political standpoint, is the more influential work. So what is the oppression to which Thoreau is responding? And so part of this is the context. So what is happening in the years leading up to Thoreau's engagement in civil disobedience by refusal to pay a tax is the Mexican War. And so the Mexican War is fought essentially over the state of Texas, or what becomes the state of Texas, which had been it had been a state as part of Mexico until the 1830s. It had initially had a Spanish-speaking population like most of Mexico. But beginning with the migration there of a large number of English-speaking people in the 1820s and 30s, it ultimately had an English-speaking majority. And it seceded from Texas as a result of the remainder of Texas abolishing slavery. When English-speaking Americans had migrated there, many of them, to establish plantations that they would operate on the basis of slavery. And so when the secession of Texas happened from Mexico, this was resisted by the Mexican government with force. As you are probably aware, this reaches its peak with the battle at the Alamo and the refusal of the soldiers that are defending the Alamo to surrender. And on that basis, then the United States intervenes on behalf of Texas, the result of which is that United States goes to war at large against Mexico. So it's not often said, but it should be made clear. The Mexican War is a war that is waged to defend slavery. specifically in the what becomes the state of Texas. The other aspect that comes into play with regard to the Mexican War is what's called manifest destiny. Anybody know this term? Know what it means? Yes?
Is it like the belief that the United States should continue to expand and something like that?
Yes. It is the belief that the United States should continue to expand. So if there is, the United States consists mainly of territory incorporated into actual formalized states of the Union to the Mississippi River, and then to unincorporated territory to the west of that up until about the Rocky Mountains at this point. It is the belief, according to manifest destiny, which just means the very clear fate of the United States, to occupy the entire continent from ocean to ocean, so that anything that is on the continent that is not yet incorporated into the United States should be. And that means territory that belongs to Mexico, territory that belongs to the UK in the northwestern part of the country, and then territory that is at that point still inhabited only by Native American groups. And this is an expansionist philosophy. Now, it's motivated to some extent by security issues. The idea, because every time that the United States pushes westward, it comes into conflict with Native American tribes, who are either resisting to some extent the expansion of this government that does not recognize them into what they consider to be their territory, or they're forcefully pushed off because of the desire of the United States to settle an increasing number of people, not to mention beginning in the 1820s and 30s, a larger number of immigrants into this territory. And as a result, it is the belief of some that the only way that the United States can ever really have security against the threat of Native American tribes attacking them is to have complete control over the continent. So, as mentioned, Texas is annexed outright by the United States. Its border is left undefined as a result of this, and increasing tension then between the United States and Mexico over where this border will lie becomes an actual war. The United States is much better equipped to fight a war at this point than Mexico is. Mexico is only independent from Spain for about 20 or 30 years at this point. And therefore, the United States not only pushes the Mexican army out of the area, but in fact drives all the way to Mexico City and forces an enormous concession of territory out of Mexico. And the other sort of important point about the Mexican War is that it's the first war the United States fights not out of defense. It's an offensive war that's fought for the expansion of the political influence and economic influence of the country, particularly through the Convention of Slavery. So this is what the United States picks up as a result of territory ceded by Mexico at the end of the war. All of California, Nevada, and Utah, as well as significant portions of Arizona and New Mexico, Colorado, and a little bit of Wyoming to boot. And then this part down here, where the border is set between Arizona and New Mexico, that is a subsequent purchase that's made by the United States from Mexico about 5 years later to set the border at the Rio Grande River. But otherwise, and then of course it also includes all of Texas as part of that territorial expansion. So since the Louisiana purchase that Thomas Jefferson makes from Napoleon in 1803, this is the largest expansion of territory that the United States makes. And then the rest of the closing of the continent essentially comes in the form of settling people on unincorporated territory and then defeating the Native American tribes that are resisting. And that takes, until close to the end of the 19th century, but a big portion of it is accomplished by virtue of this war and the territory that is gotten at the end of it. So what Thoreau is protesting in Civil Disobedience is twofold. First of all, he disagrees with the idea of fighting a war that is not a war of defense. And second, he disagrees with slavery, and so the war is sort of doubly insulting to him and to his sensibilities as an American. And that's why he then decides to mount his opposition to the war. So the reading begins on 598. Says that government is best which governs least, and by extension that government is best that governs not at all. Now that doesn't mean that he is in favor of having no government, but it does mean that he is in favor of limited government. And so in this sense, he is in this same tradition of most of the other writers that we encounter in this class, who see the role of government in the United States as being along the idea set forth by Locke of being just limited to protecting borders, protecting property, protecting people from one another. The problem with the war from that standpoint, and particularly a war that is fought not to defend the borders but to expand territory, is that it is a needless assertion of government power. And so he disagrees with it on that level. Only Locke's basic idea of the purpose of government, after all, says that you protect the borders. You don't go and expand the borders, not only because it's not moral, but because it requires the passing of taxes in order to fund it, and that's not one of the roles that Locke sees as being a necessary part of government. And he says at the bottom of 598, he distinguishes himself from these people that he calls, quote, no government men, which would be equivalent to anarchists, people who believe that the ideal state is no government at all. To speak practically, and as a citizen, unlike those who call themselves no government men, I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government. Let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that would be one step toward obtaining it. And then he begins to discuss this sort of inherent problem with democracy. And this is a problem that's been identified before by other writers, but that he takes up this cause here as well. And the topic is something that's called tyranny of the majority. So tyranny of the majority is something that occurs in democracy where what the majority wants is something that is unjust or oppressive to what the minority want. But because it's a democracy in which majority rules, the minority have no safeguard against this. And he addresses this in this first part of the long paragraph on 599. The practical reason why, when the power is once in the hands of the people, a majority are permitted and for a long time continue to rule, is not because they are most likely to be in the right, nor because this seems fairest to the minority, but because they are physically the strongest. But a government in which the majority rule in all cases cannot be based on justice, even as far as men understand it. So his question that he puts forward is basically this. We operate on the basis of majority rule according to our thinking that, and again, this connects with a lot of other things that we've already looked at, according to beliefs like those of Cicero that law should most closely reflect that which is just, and that which is just according to him is that which is divinely ordained. But he says there's no guarantee, and Cicero says this as well, there's no guarantee that what the majority of the people want is always going to be right. And we can identify the holes in that particular logic on the basis of our own religious beliefs, or even our lack of religious belief being different from what the ancient Romans believed. The morality of Zeus or Jupiter being different from the morality of the Judeo-Christian Islamic God, who believes, for instance, that adultery is wrong, whereas Zeus believes adultery is awesome, right? So there's automatically an inherent problem in tying your law to religious belief on that basis, because nobody can really say that it's objective. Now that said, the Enlightenment tells us that reason is our highest achievement, not belief, and that to the extent that we are able to apply evidence and logic to a problem that faces us, reason should dictate our best possible outcome. And if we allow government to operate on the basis of reason to its greatest extent, then the law should be just. But it isn't. And he uses this example because it's the topic of what he is protesting, but it's a worthwhile thing to consider in a more abstract sense as well, which is that if the majority of the people want something that is objectively immoral, but they don't see it as immoral, then there's automatically going to be a big problem that emerges there. Because in the example of slavery, it's clear that at the very least, at this point, historically speaking, the majority of the people either want it or have no opinion about it. Whereas it's only a minority that would actively seek to abolish slavery. And that's problematic not only because of the aforementioned points about religious belief being part of the problem here. A big proportion of the people that are actively arguing to maintain the legality of slavery in the United States are arguing it on a religious basis. Never mind that the abolitionists are actually doing the same thing and arguing against it on a religious basis, so there's part of your problem. But if you extract yourself from economic concerns and specifically from racism that is either justified by economic terms or that justifies itself or seeks to justify economic terms, if you extract race from it, then you can't see it as anything other than unjust. It's not just to not pay a person for their labor. It's not just to hold a person without any freedom against their will. So that being the case, clearly slavery provides an example from Thoreau's standpoint where the majority wants something that is clearly unjust. What do you do in a situation like that? Well, a better question to maybe ask ourselves in this particular case is, well, what does the United States do in this case? What is the United States' answer in the 1840s for tyranny of the majority? If the majority of the people want something unjust, where's the safeguard against this? Remember that the United States defines itself as a liberal democracy, right? And there are two particular aspects that make a liberal democracy. And the first one is, you all know both aspects of liberal democracy by this point. Voting, right? So universal suffrage. Although it takes us a while to get there on that one. The other one is that it emphasizes the importance of individual rights over what the group wants. So if what the group wants would violate individual rights, then liberal democracy says that you don't get that law. That's the safeguard against abuse of power under a liberal democracy. So here's my next question. If that is the safeguard against injustice in a liberal democracy, then how is it that a country that is more than 50 years old at this point still has legalized slavery? Why is there still slavery if it's a liberal democracy? They still have slavery because there's just not an overall recognition of the idea that black people have rights, that they are individuals in the way that the law defines them. So it's not even so much that it's a problem with the system as with the definition of the terms before the system is even put into place. And again, you can see this in the Constitution, which takes its time to make sure that there's no mistake about this. When it's enumerating the rights of the people, when it's enumerating who's a citizen, when it's enumerating what protections people get, it goes out of its way to exclude black people and Indians, right off the bat. So what do you do in a situation like this, where the system itself is supposed to prevent tyranny of the majority, but there is a clear disconnect between the objective idea of this and the way that it's actually being carried out? For Thoreau, this is is more immediate to him as a thinker than it is to a lot of other people, particularly outside of where he lives, because in New England there was never really legalized slavery. So slavery to him is something that is really alien, not something that he recognizes as being any kind of legitimate institution. It's like that in Pennsylvania as well, but Pennsylvania borders areas with legalized slavery, and slaves come in and out of Philadelphia. So it's a little bit easier for one to suspend one's disbelief about the whole institution itself, because it's at least proximal. But in Massachusetts, it's not. It's just completely alien. There are free black people in Massachusetts and always have been. You know, the first casualty of the Revolutionary War in the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks, is a freed black man. The first all African-American unit that's formed during the Civil War is formed out of Massachusetts, and that's by design, because there are enough free black people in Massachusetts to do this, and there always have been. So for Thoreau, this really makes no sense. But for a big proportion of the nation, obviously the majority of them located in the South, where slavery is a well-supported institution politically and economically and culturally, they don't give it a second thought by and large. But an increasing number of people due in part to abolitionist movement that's begun in New England and is moving forth out of there. People are beginning to now question this. So what solution does the Constitution offer to a problem like this? To a problem whereby a minority of the people in the country see tremendous injustice, want this injustice to be remedied in some way, but legal means are not there. I mean, yeah, it's ultimately the problem is solved through amending the Constitution. The war takes care of some of that, but it doesn't take care of enough of it, which is to say that by the powers that are invested in the president during the war, he's able to abolish slavery in certain places, but it takes an amendment to the Constitution ultimately to abolish it entirely. And as I hope was demonstrated in our discussion about the Constitution, that is a rather rigorous process to amend the Constitution, particularly when a substantial portion of your states, which have been empowered to a greater extent than their populations might perhaps warrant, are resistant to it, then it's going to be really difficult. So his answer is that only resistance will bring the issue to the fore. So in discussing how the majority rules unjustly, he continues, and this is about halfway through that paragraph on page 599. Law never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of the injustice. A common and natural result of an undue respect for law is that you may see a file of soldiers, colonel, captain, corporal, privates, powder monkeys, and all marching in admirable order over hill and dale to the wars against their wills, aye, against their common sense and consciences, which makes it very steep marching indeed, and produces a palpitation of the heart. They have no doubt that it is a damnable business in which they are concerned. They are all peaceably inclined. Now what are they, men at all, or small movable forts and magazines at the service of some unscrupulous man in power? Visit the Navy Yard and behold a Marine such a man as an American government can make, or such as it can make a man with its black arts, a mere shadow and reminiscence of humanity. So he enunciates a point here, by the way, that is that Martin Luther King in particular picks up later on, which is that a bigger problem, or an equal problem at least, to the problem of injustice under the law, a law that countenances injustice, incorporates injustice, and allows it to continue, is that there are too few people who might even take issue with the way that the law is, who don't actually stand up and resist to any great extent. And it is their failure to resist that keeps the law in place. So when they are asked to go and fight a war, for instance, he says they get up and they fight it. They are stirred to, perhaps by feelings of patriotism. or by the sort of the overall message of men marching and their desire to be part of that group, that they don't consider their individual disagreement with the way that, that things are going. He says on the following page that men serve the state like machines. So he says, this is the third paragraph on 600. All machines have their friction, and possibly this does enough good to counterbalance the evil. At any rate, it is a great evil to make a stir about it. But when the friction comes to have its machine, and oppression and robbery are organized, I say, let us not have such a machine any longer. So his point here is this, is that if you have a machine that is operating like one that produces injustice, then there can be friction that will stop that machine from running. But when the machine itself is the friction, then it takes something even greater to stand in its way. And that, for his own part, is not greater force or greater friction, but rather to step outside the paradigm entirely and resist it in some substantively different way. In that same paragraph, he says, when the friction comes to have its machine in oppression and robbery are organized, I say, let us not have such a machine any longer. In other words, when a sixth of the population of a nation which is undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army and subjected to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. What makes this duty the more urgent is the fact that the country so overrun is not our own, but ours is the invading army. So the message there is clear. The purpose of his rebellion is against these two things, slavery and the war. He says on 601, people, that there are thousands who are, in opinion, opposed to slavery and to the war. But their refusal or inability or lack of desire or disinterest in standing up to it is, again, part of the problem that keeps the machinery of injustice running. And he talks about the problem that is posed by voting at the bottom of that same page. The last paragraph on 601. All voting is a sort of gaming like checkers or backgammon with a slight moral tinge to it, a playing with right and wrong with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it. The character of the voters is not staked. I cast my vote perchance as I think right, but I am not vitally concerned that the right should prevail. I am willing to leave it to the majority. Its obligation, therefore, never exceeds that of expediency. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it. It is only expressing to men feebly your desire that it should prevail. A wise man will not leave the right to the mercy of chance, nor wish it to prevail through the power of the majority. So his point here is that it isn't enough to vote when injustice exists. If you vote against injustice, it doesn't go your way, and you throw your hands up and say, well, I voted, I did my best, you haven't done your best. If you voted against injustice and the vote doesn't go your way, then the next step that you have to take is to actively engage against the injustice. There is but little virtue in the action of masses of men. When the majority shall at length vote for the abolition of slavery, it will be because they are indifferent to slavery, or because there is but little slavery left to be abolished by their vote. They will then be the only slaves. Only his vote can hasten the abolition of slavery, who asserts his own freedom by his vote. At the very least, he says, the people who oppose slavery should, he says, wash their hands of it. They should refuse to engage with the practice insofar as allowing it, reaping any benefit from what's produced by it, doing business with people who engage in it, refuse to countenance it in terms of it interacting with their life on any daily basis. He says on 603 about unjust laws, the first full paragraph on that page. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded, or shall we transgress them at once? Men generally under such a government as this think that they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them. They think that if they should exist, the remedy would be worse than the evil, but it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. Why is it not more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? Why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it cry and resist before it is hurt? Why does it not encourage its citizens to be on alert to point out its faults and do better than it would have them? Why does it always crucify Christ and excommunicate Copernicus and Luther and pronounce Washington and Franklin rebels? And here's examples that are designed to show us that not all the time is a just person recognized to be just when he or she is actively engaging the public mind. But often it is with hindsight that those people are seen as just people. If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go, let it go. Perchance it will wear smooth. Certainly the machine will wear out. If the injustice has a spring or a pulley or a rope or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. But if it is such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see at any rate that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. So you need to consider, well, to what extent is what I am doing by doing nothing contributing to the ongoing problem of whatever this evil thing is? So you can vote, and you can vote in the quote-unquote right way, and that's one way of voicing your concern and disagreement and mounting your resistance to something that is unjust. And that can go your way or not go your way. You can disengage from it and refuse to take part in it in any substantive way, like, from a boycott. So if there's a product that's being produced by slavery, for instance, you might say, as a store owner, for instance, that you're not going to stock that particular item in your store, and that's your way of registering your disagreement. But at heart, what is necessary for you to do to register your discontent with what the government does that is unjust? And its answer is that it needs to be actively engaged, that you need to openly break a law that is unjust to register your discontent with it, to, quote, let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. And he says you can try to do that by voting, but voting is operating within the machinery of the state. And when the state is the evil itself, when the very constitution of the state allows for something that is evil, then operating within that constitution doesn't make any sense. You have to operate outside of it. You have to operate outside of the law. You can make an argument for operating within a system, bringing a system down from within, using the machinery of an unjust system to conquer that injustice. But his argument here, and again, it is an argument that's picked up by later theoreticians on this point, particularly by Gandhi on this particular point, is that if you use an unjust machinery to achieve the overthrowing of injustice, you have sullied your attempt, because the end does not justify the means. If you seek a just goal, then the means by which you pursue that goal must also be just. This is why, for instance, for both Gandhi and for King, nonviolence is so important. They are seeking to overthrow systems that are reinforced through the use of violence. And their point in emphasizing as strongly as they do the nonviolent aspect of this, although they also emphasize direct action, breaking of the law, and acceptance of the consequences for doing so. Their emphasis on nonviolence is very much tied to the idea that if you use violent means to achieve even a just end, you have done some greater moral wrong that taints it from the very outset. That's not all of why they emphasize nonviolence, but it is an important part of it. So what is his conclusion, Thoreau's conclusion about the way to do this? Well, he says, well, I don't have any interaction with the state on any real basis, particularly the federal government. And here it's important to remind ourselves that the system of the United States is one of federalism, right? There's a federal government and there are state governments. And under a federal system, the federal government's powers are supposed to be limited. By and large, to this point since 1787, the United States federal government has seen fit to leave the issue of slavery in the hands of the individual states. And in the state of Massachusetts, there's no slavery, so it's not an issue. And the state of Massachusetts, for that matter, didn't go to war with Mexico, so that's no issue as well. Finally, in the 1840s, there is no federal income tax. So he can't refuse to pay his federal income tax as a form of protest against what the federal government does, because there's no federal income tax. So how can he register his discontent? Well, there is one way in which he interacts with the federal government. And by the way, in the 1840s, people's interactions with the federal government were extremely limited almost always. Unless there was a war going on, and that war was being supported by a draft in some way, or by some special tax or a tariff that was being passed that affected your business, you were not going to have a lot of interaction with the federal government. And you were going to, by and large, beyond that, see yourself much more as a citizen of the state in which you lived versus the United States of America. At the very least, you would see your being a Pennsylvanian or a Massachusetts resident or what have you as being equivalent on the same level of importance as your being a citizen of the United States. The only time that being a citizen of the United States really mattered before the Civil War was when you traveled outside the United States and you needed the protection of the United States government for some reason, or again, if there was a war. But the powers of the federal government were very limited and by design. That being the case, there is this one way in which Thoreau interacts with the federal government, and he mentions it on page 604. I meet this American government or its representative, the state government, directly and face-to-face once a year, no more in the person of its tax gatherer. And here, this is not the income tax, but is the poll tax, the tax that he pays in order to keep the functioning of the machinery of federal elections in the state of Massachusetts going on. And because he isn't mailing in this tax payment, but it's being collected by a tax collector, this will be his point of registering his complaint. If you're a tax evader in the United States today through income tax, that means you don't send in a federal income tax return, and then you get a letter from the IRS and they say you owe this, that, and the other. And if you don't pay, then they say, well, now you owe us this plus penalties. And if you don't pay, then they say, okay, we're going to arrest you if you don't pay. And then if you don't pay, they come and arrest you. And they charge you and usually convict you, and plus they get their money anyway. That's because we set up the IRS to do all those things, and we gave it a significant amount of power. None of those things existed in the 1840s, and when the tax collector came, he would collect his money and he would be on his way, and you wouldn't see him again for another year. But this was the one point of interaction. So he says on page 606, bottom of 606, I've paid no poll tax for 6 years. I was put into a jail once on this account for one night, and as I stood considering the walls of solid stone, 2 or 3 feet thick, a door of wood and iron, a foot thick, an iron grating which strained the light, I could not help but being struck by the foolishness of that institution which treated me as if I were mere flesh and blood and bones to be locked up. I wondered that it should have concluded at length that this was the best use it could put me to, and had never thought to avail itself of my services in some way. I saw that if there was a wall of stone between me and my townsmen, there was still a more difficult one to climb or break through before they could get to me as free as I was. You can put me in jail, but you can't imprison my soul and spirit. Now he says, on top of that, so he's refused to pay the poll tax. He's been put in jail for it. And but he says he still pays the highway tax because that's a tax that he understands he needs to use the roads. He agrees with the government taxing him, his state government in this case, taxing him for use of the highway. And that's fine. It's this specific poll tax, because it has to do with the elections, because it has to do with the federal government, and because it's the federal government that keeps slavery legal and that pursues the war in Mexico, that he registers his complaint on that basis. So it is a selective protest as well. So what do we have so far? He openly breaks the law by refusing to make the payment when the tax collector comes. He accepts the punishment that's given to him to spend time in jail, and he does not fight back with any violence. He goes willingly, and even though he's not subjected to physical violence as part of this prospect, he assures us that he would not mount any violent defense if he were to do so. But there's something else that he gets out of this, which is that anytime he doesn't pay his tax, I mean, his name goes in the newspaper, and everybody knows that he was arrested. And that is sort of the other part of this, which is by doing this, by drawing attention to himself in doing this, rather than just registering his complaint, spending a night or a week or whatever in jail, and then going home and doing the same thing the next year, 6 years in a row, people find out about this, and not because he tells them, because they either see him being taken away or they see his name being reported in the newspapers having been arrested. And in that way, he draws publicity for what it is that he's doing. And then, and more importantly perhaps, because he does so, he accepts the punishment willingly and without violent protest, he elevates his moral purpose above that of the government that taxes him in the first place. And this is, again, the counterpoint to what Gandhi and King subsequently do. Yes, they are concerned about not using violence because they are concerned about the idea of tainting their goal through unjust means of inflicting violence on others. But they also know, both of them, particularly as non-white people fighting white power structures, that if they engage in violence, they will undercut their moral superiority to that which they fight. Because a readership in the media that sees them, or is at the very least perhaps more likely to see them as less than human, will draw that conclusion more readily when violence becomes the means by which they pursue their goal. Thoreau doesn't have that issue, but he does count on remaining at a higher moral level than his opposition in this case. He concludes the essay on 611. The authority of government, even such as I am willing to submit to, for I will cheerfully obey those who know and can do better than I, and in many things even those who neither know nor can do so well, is still an impure one. To be strictly just, it must have the sanction and consent of the governed. It can have no pure right over my person and property from what I concede to it. The progress from an absolute to a limited monarchy, from a limited monarchy to a democracy, is a progress toward a true respect for the individual. So he acknowledges that the political history that has led up to the present moment for him in the United States in the 1840s is one that has moved toward justice the entire time, that has moved toward greater recognition of the rights of all people, and to the greater recognition of the importance and the sanctity of the rights of the individual. But there is more way to go. And the extent to which the right to govern derives from the consent of the governed, his ability to continue to withhold that consent in some substantive way, particularly when that withholding of that consent is made public, but is done so in a morally unreproachable way, gives him an edge that other kinds of protest would not. Last sentence, he writes, "A state which bore this kind of fruit and suffered it to drop off as fast as it ripened would prepare the way for a still more perfect and glorious state, which also I have imagined but not yet anywhere seen." So this is the formulation of the ideology in its earliest form, at least as stated in a Western tradition by a writer in the English language. There are, of course, extended traditions of nonviolence. Right, I mean, at heart, the Christian message is a nonviolent message, right? This is one of the core principles that Jesus teaches. If somebody is violent to you, you don't answer that with violence. You turn the other cheek. Not only because it is the right thing to do from a moral standpoint, but because you don't allow yourself to be dragged down by people that are unjust and immoral. You have a standard of behavior as a right-thinking moral person that requires you to maintain that elevated level despite what the world throws at you. Your reward for that is what is given to you after you die. So that can only translate to a certain extent into an environment of a secular government, right? The government can't promise you life after death. Government can't promise you salvation. And therefore, it's going to be harder for you to be convinced in a purely secular environment that nonviolence is the best thing for you. It requires other kinds of incentivization for you to accept it. Because after all, I mean, it's not as if what Christian morality is teaching you is an easy thing, right? I mean, Jesus is telling you if you're struck on the cheek to turn the other cheek. That's inherently asking you to go against your very nature as a human being. When you're struck, you want to strike back. That's why most religious philosophies don't teach that. Not because it's right or wrong, but because it asks you to go against your inherent nature as a mammal, basically. And so, yeah, it calls for a higher moral clarity and purpose. But in a secularized environment, something else has to be promised than what religion can offer. And for Thoreau, and then subsequently for King, for Gandhi, it's less complicated because first of all, there's also a religious tradition of nonviolence, as well as a political environment that still largely encourages a religious kind of orientation, that he's able to maintain that a little bit more easily. But for King himself, the idea of nonviolence is not at all alien because he's a Baptist preacher. But for the people that he is training to engage in this struggle against an unjust system of laws that will not hesitate to use violence if it sees it is necessary, and to use that violence against the most vulnerable people in that society, including children, then that's a very tall order to ask. And so it's necessary for King in particular to hold extensive trainings to assure that when people are struck, when they have dogs and fire hoses turned on them, they won't fight back. And it doesn't always work either. So again, it is a very idealized moral philosophy, but arguably one that is highly effective. So I'm not going to get into the readings by King tonight, but I will provide some of the connection between these two because it does require some background as well as some consideration of what we've already discussed. So before the Civil War, before 1852, the major political parties in the United States are the Democratic Party, which is at that point heavily identified with the South, with states' rights, and with the institution of slavery, and what is called the Whig Party, which is basically formed as opposition to President Jackson, who was the first president to really hold broad popular support across class lines in particular. And for that reason, he's a very potent political force. He's also Southern and a slaveholder and quite wealthy. And so, he chooses, like Washington before him, not to run for 2 terms, but easily could have been president forever if he wanted to, because he was that popular. The Whigs are therefore formed as a party to oppose his hold on power, but they don't have any really coherent position on slavery. Instead, they have their basis of power in areas that Jackson doesn't, basically in the more urbanized and industrialized areas. With the struggle over slavery, though, heating up, particularly in the 1850s, the Whig Party breaks up over the issue, with the anti-slavery Whigs forming the Republican Party. Among the Republican Party, its core issue is that it's anti-slavery. Because it draws from the initial Whig basis of power, it therefore is also heavily associated with the more industrialized areas, more urbanized areas of the country. The more radical wing of the party seeks abolition, whereas the more moderate wing of the party, from which Lincoln comes, is seeking, at the very least, to make sure that it doesn't spread. And so the Republican Party becomes very strongly associated with the abolition movement, although there is, generally speaking, a kind of wait-and-see approach with regard to the way things will shake out, because it is not until 1860 that a Republican is actually elected president. As I mentioned in the class on the Constitution, in 1808, the Congress bans the transatlantic slave trade. But with the addition of additional states to the Union, the issue of where slavery will be legal and not legal will continue to cause a lot of unrest. Missouri and Maine will be the first states that will be admitted on the one free state, one slave state basis. Kansas and Nebraska after that. I mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act in a previous class. This is, again, just something that lends greater economic support to something that's already a law, which is that you can't, a slave is not free by virtue of his or her escape to a free state. And then in 1857, the Dred Scott case, which comes as a direct result of the Fugitive Slave Act, it essentially states as law that black people are not citizens of the country. Then increasing violence on the level of individuals seeking to oppose slavery, those who choose the violent route as opposed to the nonviolent route, probably most famously John Brown of Kansas, launching guerrilla actions against slave markets in Virginia. And so an increasing atmosphere of violence and of the country sort of being rent apart by this comes to a head when Lincoln is elected the president in 1860. His election is greeted by the secession of the southern states and the Civil War. So, some brief points about this. First of all, in any Civil War, bet on the North. Always a safe bet. Second point, the Civil War is the first major expansion of federal power in the United States. And it is done specifically for the abolition of slavery. People will sometimes say that the Civil War was a war that was fought over states' rights. That's true. It was fought over the states' rights to have slavery legal. Any other states' rights didn't matter except for that one. With the end of the war, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed. Remember, 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment gives citizenships to black Americans. 15th Amendment guarantees their right to vote. The 12 years that follow the Civil War are called Reconstruction. This is direct military occupation of the southern states, as well as the broad suppression of the right to vote of Confederate veterans and office holders, which means that for the first time in the country's history, a large number of African Americans are elected to political office in the South, as well as people called carpetbaggers, who are people from the North who know that they can run on the Republican ticket in the South and get office because all the Confederate veterans are Democrats, and so nobody really has a chance of winning on that ticket. And The emergence of the Ku Klux Klan at this point is a direct reaction to the emancipation of slaves and their political enfranchisement. And the Ku Klux Klan is in every sense of the word, a terrorist organization. It engages in political violence for political purposes, and it targets civilians. So this goes on for 12 years. The full military occupation pulls back slowly, first in some places rather than in others. In the deeper parts of the South, it remains pretty strong. In the more border areas, it is less severe. But by the end of 12 years, the country is basically ready to get rid of it. Mainly because, and what sort of causes this to happen is that there's a very close election between the Democrats and Republicans in 1876. The Democrats actually win the election in the popular vote, but the Republicans win in the Electoral College. And rather than the Democrats protesting the outcome of the election, the agreement is made that the Republican, Hayes, will become the president, but he will end Reconstruction, and that's what he does. And then over the course of the next 25 years, the southern states begin to reintroduce segregation on a legal basis and to suppress the black vote. The question always emerges, well, if the 15th Amendment guarantees black people the right to vote, how are they able to suppress the black vote in the southern states so successfully? And the answer is by passing laws that don't suppress the right to vote per se, but instead place restrictions on voting such that it becomes extraordinarily difficult for most black people to qualify. Because illiteracy is very high among the black population in the South, for instance, they institute a literacy requirement. Because most black people are still sharecroppers, they institute a property requirement, things like that. And then when that doesn't work, the Ku Klux Klan will use terrorist violence and intimidation to assure that black people do not vote. Because in some of the southern states, Mississippi in particular, they constitute the majority, and therefore, given the right to vote, they would vote in Republicans who would continue the reforms that they had enjoyed for the first 12 years after the war. It becomes necessary for the southern states to return to a situation that is more amenable to what they were used to before, to make sure that the black vote is, for all intents and purposes, non-existent in the South. And that is a situation that obtains right through to the 1960s. These are called Jim Crow laws. Not just the voting laws, but more importantly, the public segregation laws. A Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 has the court ruling that segregation is legal provided that the facilities that are provided are separate but equal. They must be of equal quality. This will begin to be eroded with the United States' entry into World War I, because it will be the first war in which black soldiers are drafted in the same numbers as white soldiers are drafted. And so a large number of black American soldiers will fight in Europe. And then they will come home and they will not want to return to segregation, particularly because having served in France, they have been able to enjoy on their leave, for instance, completely unsegregated facilities, and therefore they're not looking to return to that. The backlash against this is pretty enormous. Part of this has to do with the fact that the President of the United States at that time, Woodrow Wilson, is immensely racist in a way that we really don't see since then. And so he is perfectly willing to countenance all of these kinds of outrages, including the beginning of widespread lynching in the South and even into the Midwest, and to a limited extent in the North, as a way of assuring these black soldiers when they return that they're going to fall right back in line, or they're going to pay with their lives. The reaction to this is then a massive migration of black Americans from the Deep South, where they are overwhelmingly located until the 1920s. The urban populations in the cities in the North, in the Midwest, and on the West Coast originate essentially at this time. It nevertheless remains the case that the majority of the black population is in the South until after World War II. And the highest concentrations of the black population in the country remain in the Deep South, although they're also high in number in in urban centers in the North, not across the whole sort of landscape as they are in the South. Giving rise to the expression that when the United States gets a cold, the Black America gets the flu. During the Great Depression, white unemployment or national unemployment is 33%. In the Black community, it reaches 50%. President Franklin Roosevelt, is sympathetic to the plight of African Americans, greatly so, in fact. But in order to pass the New Deal, he requires the support of the Southern members of his party. Because remember, the base of support for the Democratic Growth Party until 1964 remains in the Deep South. So he wins a landslide election in 1932 and another in 1936, but he can't get legislation passed without his party, many of whom are conservative, mainly because of the race issue. And so we'll fight him on this, provided that as long as the New Deal will be unlimited, which is to say that they will agree to housing laws, but they will not agree to housing laws that will allow for unsegregated housing. They will agree to public spending on public sector works, but not if they benefit Black communities. And so while the country recovers by and large as a result of the New Deal, this is held back significantly in the Deep South in particular. After the war, President Truman from Missouri becomes president, and there is some fear that as a border Southerner, he will be unfriendly on civil rights, but actually turns out to be one of the better presidents on this particular issue. He, by executive order, desegregates the armed forces in 1948. And in doing this, he greatly angers the segregationist wing of the party, who temporarily, in this case, bolt from the party. They run the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, for president against him in 1948, but Truman still manages to win. And then finally, the big push from the judiciary sector comes in 1954. The Supreme Court decides in Brown versus the Board of Education that the previous ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson of separate but equal facilities for Black and white citizens was unconstitutional, and therefore that the schools in Topeka, Kansas, and by extension all public schools in the United States should be desegregated. This was a unanimous decision, 9-0. It's significant too, by the way, because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1954 was Earl Warren. Earl Warren had been the governor of California during the forced relocation of Japanese Americans to concentration camps. And so there was tremendous fear when President Eisenhower had appointed Earl Warren to the court that segregation issues would not be looked on favorably by the Chief Justice, because he had overseen probably the single greatest outrage against minority Americans in the history of the country since the Civil War. Nevertheless, Earl Warren turned out to be extraordinarily progressive as a Supreme Court justice, and shepherded this particular ruling through, including the vote of Hugo Black from Alabama, who had been a member of the Klan at one point, voted for desegregation of schools. So this, by the way, provided a mandate for the President Eisenhower, who was also very progressive on issues of race, to then deploy the National Guard to desegregate schools, which he did for the first time in 1957. And it is in this environment of the Supreme Court ruling against segregation, the federal government having to use physical force in order to accomplish this, that the Montgomery bus boycott happens in 1955. This is where Rosa Parks famously refuses to move her seat on a public bus in Montgomery, and as a result is arrested, fined $25. And it is onto that scene that Martin Luther King appears, because it is he who has largely behind the scenes actually orchestrated this to happen in the first place. It was not just an accident that Rosa Parks refused to get up on a bus. It had been planned, and that there would be this deployment then of a very public protest against the segregated busing system. This was a deliberate move to expand desegregation, according to the Brown case, to apply to all public facilities and not only to schools, which is why it happened as quickly as it did. and why Martin Luther King appeared as quickly as he did on the scene. And that really is where we should probably leave it. So we'll end there. Any questions before we part for your Thanksgiving break? All right, I will see you a week from tonight.